face holds nothing on the providence I know. No longer bound to things of wood and stone. When all I had to offer was my worst, you saw my heavy heart and loved me first. Your beauty staring down my brokenness. You chose to throw your heart into the mess. Compassion crashing down upon my dead. You were there all this time, like a river running through my failures. You carried me all this time, like the splinters buried in your shoulders. You carry me now, hallelujah. If ever now my heart cries hallelujah, if ever now in the wonder of your grace, 1,000 times, 1,000 years my soul will say grace. You saw the crushing weight my flesh deserved. You kneeled and wrought forgiveness in the dirt. One by one the stones fell where they lay, as one by one the accusers walked away. With nothing left to throw, they made a cross. And knowing only love could count the cost, you were there all this time, like a river running through my failure. You carried me all this time, like the splinters buried in your shoulders. Your love carried all that shame. Jesus, how my soul will praise you. You carried me all this way, like a diamond in the scars upon your crown. You carry me now, hallelujah. If ever now my heart cries hallelujah, if ever now in the wonder of your grace, 1,000 times, 1,000 years my soul will say hallelujah. Forever now in the greatness of my Savior, forever now in the brightness of your name. Jesus, on this rock I'll sing your praise. Hallelujah. There's a longing that reaches past the stars, and there's an answer every question why. There's a name, and there's a hope flowing through these veins. There's a voice that echoes through the pain. There's an ember ready for the flame. There's a name. We will fix our eyes on the one who overcame. We will stand in awe of the one who breaks the chains. Yes, love has a name. Love has a name. Jesus. Love has a name. Love has a name. Jesus. There's a joy triumphs over fear. There's a laughter that wipes away all tears. There's a presence changes atmospheres. Yes, there's a name. We will fix our eyes on the one who overcame. Yes, and we will stand in awe of the one who breaks the chains. Yes, love has a name. Love has a name. Jesus. Love has a name. Love has a name. Jesus. Oh, victory has a name. Victory has a name. Jesus. Yes, joy has a name. Joy has a name. Jesus. The name that's lifted up forever. The name that shakes the earth and shakes the heavens. The hope of every heart, Savior of the world, Jesus. Jesus. Love has a name. Love has a name. Jesus. And hope has a name. Hope has a name. Jesus. Yes, love has a name. Love has a name. Jesus. Yes, love has a name. Love has a name. Jesus.
Welcome to Westside Online. We're so glad that you would join us for a service. Now, we always want you to know that there's someone available for you on the other side of your screen, and we want to help you get connected to all that's happening across Westside. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, or just looking for ways that you can get involved, send me an email at tmccombs@wkc.org, and I would love to help get you connected. Now, just a couple of things for you to be aware of what's going on around Westside. And the first is this, is we've created new ways for you to engage with content and your own spiritual growth throughout the week. We've recently launched a podcast that can be found on all of your favorite podcast platforms, the Westside Kings Church podcast. So go search it, find it, subscribe to it, and you'll get content throughout the week dropped right onto your phone or whatever device you listen on. And as well, if you prefer seeing it in video, we're going to post these to YouTube also, so you can subscribe so you get notifications when new videos are posted. Now, Easter is also just around the corner, which we've talked about recently, but again, just want to remind you that there's a few ways for you to be involved at Easter this year. The first is through our Stations at the Cross in-person event that's coming in a couple of weeks. It's happening on the 29th, the 30th, the 31st of March from 11 to 7 p.m. You pick your time slot, and we will make sure that you can come be in the facility and take in this great way to work towards the journey of the cross and Resurrection Sunday. So sign up at wkc.org/Easter and reserve your spot as spaces are limited. And secondly, we have our Liturgy at Home, which is our Maundy Thursday kit, and we're actually adding a component to it that allows us to serve others. You can pick up a grocery card and drop it off when you come pick up your kit, and then we are going to give it to some of our local partners that allow them to...
Pretty good. Have you tried some?
It's meant for Thursday, Maundy Thursday. The recipe is meant to be made on Maundy Thursday. You're too early, Will.
Still pretty good. You should try it.
Anyways, when you bring a grocery card to the church, we'll deliver it to some of our local partners who will get the opportunity then to purchase the same ingredients that you'll find within the recipe list of our Maundy Thursday kit, and they can make it also. So those kits are ready for you to pick up if that's what you've selected, and if you're looking for delivery, a team member will be in touch with you to schedule the delivery.
In this series, The Edge of the City, we're hoping to make the point that the prophetic task of the church, of any Christian community, is to be present in the place where they live. But more than simply present, we think the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament show us, in a very specific way, how to be present. Now, you can catch up with parts 1 and 2 of the series if you want to learn more about how we understand this phrase, edge of the city, and how it functions as a metaphor that calls us to live in wholeness. But the vision of the prophets seems to thread its way throughout the Bible and into the life of the early church, and we think it should also inspire the church today. It's a vision to imagine an alternative to the way things are. The prophets saw their world on a particular trajectory that wasn't going to end well for them. So they interjected into that place, into their society, their world, their city, with a call to imagine an alternative. For most of the prophets, the way things are was represented by the king, the dominant, powerful, and richest member of society, who had the most to lose if things were to change. He was invested into the royal way of being, so he naturally supported it. However, so dominant was this, what Walter Brueggemann calls royal consciousness, that even those who suffered under the oppressive regime of the king would commonly struggle to imagine something different. So it's not insignificant that in the book of Isaiah, one of the great prophets of Scripture, a turning point near the start of the book at chapter 6 has this scene in it. And notice the language of how it begins. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Now, this is a phenomenal prophetic scene. It's a moment of alternative. Two ways of thinking come together at a particular moment. The old way, the royal consciousness of King Uzziah, it comes to an end. And in its place, we see a new king, a true king. But this is not a like-for-like swap. As the angels in verse 3 of the vision, they say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." So the contrast is that the way the world appears, that is, under the rule of the king, is a hoax, because the earth is actually full of the true king's glory. Now, Brueggemann goes on to frame the task of the church well in relation to this. He frames it like this: the prophetic tasks of the church are to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion, to grieve in a society that practices denial, and to express hope in a society that lives in despair. To be a community, or even an individual who lives at the edge of the city, is to live guided by a belief that the royal, it's just the way things are, isn't the true reality. The question that the prophets pose to us is whether we can imagine that alternative, better, more authentic way of being. Like, can we see beyond just the way things are? And this is where we often start to lose cabin pressure on our thoughts of an alternative way of being. Generally speaking, most of us can see that the world isn't working as it should. We can see the problems, we know what they are, but they just seem insurmountable. It's enough for me to just keep on top of family life, much less think about what's up with my city. I can maybe think about inequality and debt and injustice, but I can really only just think about it when I'm trying to stay afloat in my own life. We know that there's issues of homelessness, people trafficking, abuse, poverty. But is it hard to imagine anything different because it just seems beyond us and our capacity? And so it's easier to actually become a little numb to it all by just accepting that this is just the way things are. The question from the prophets is, can we imagine something different? And this is ultimately the question I hope you will wrestle with from this series. To live metaphorically at the edge of the city is the call to not be overcome by what we're calling the royal way things are, but rather to live differently, which begins by learning to imagine differently. And I know that imagining is hard work. As soon as we try, the sort of negative trinity of, is it realistic? Is it practical? Is it viable? They appear and start to choke the life out of your imagination. And this is the point then, when we as a community need to learn from our children. Because creativity and dreams of something different aren't shaped by realism and practicalities. Children teach us all this all the time. They're shaped by beginning to imagine freely. I've always enjoyed the quote, which is often attributed to Anton de Saint-Exupéry, which says, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the people to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." Like yearning, imagining, believing. These things are at the roots of anything being different. Like Isaiah had a vision. "I saw the Lord," he says. Things could be different. Now, when we start to think this way, it becomes almost impossible to not start thinking about Jesus. And I get that categorizing Jesus as a prophet might sound theologically risky, but just be honest for a moment, most categories are inadequate to describe Jesus. However, Jesus' very presence, not to mention his teaching ministry, challenged the way things are. He announced the end of an old way of being and the beginning of a new way of being. His first apparent public sermon began with him choosing to read from, wait for it, Isaiah. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus reads a section from Isaiah 61 that says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Like Jesus is dismantling the way things are, using this text from Isaiah, another prophet who wanted to do that. And Jesus' constant refrain throughout the Gospels is, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." His Sermon on the Mount, if you pay attention to it, isn't just a list of rules, but it's an imaginative piece about how things could be. As Sky Jethani says, it's a description of what life could look like if you open yourself up to God's grace. But what I want you to note, maybe the next time you read the Gospels, is the manner in which Jesus actually implements his imaginative changes. Like God in flesh with us, breathing our air, covered in our dust. Do you know what he does? He does small things, small changes, micro adjustments that could be missed, but turn out to be massive. And I want to think about some of them with you. Only some, because there's way more than we can list in one teaching. But here are just some points I want you to pick up on. Jesus was always ready to forgive. Is that your best evidence, you might say? Seems a little bit obvious. But pause for a moment and think about how forgiveness evidences a different way of life, a change from just the way things are. Because when Jesus talks about forgiveness, he doesn't often talk about our relationship with God, which is often where we have the conversations about forgiveness within Christianity. Rather, when Jesus talks about God's forgiveness, it's as a model for our interpersonal relationships. And yet, despite that, our society today doesn't forgive well. And a society that doesn't know how to forgive is a broken society. And think and reflect for a moment on how rarely we see or do forgiveness in the contemporary context. Like criminal reform and restoration of offenders is notoriously faulty, with the risk of reincarceration being unrighteously high. And what about financial forgiveness? People are constantly held in lifelong unpayable debts. The poor are preyed upon by wealthy loan companies. Or bankruptcy, with all of its life-altering facets, not to mention the social stigma that accompanies it. Or what about simply failing? In our culture, in our society, if you fail, people don't forget. So forgiveness is hard to find. Which means that when you hear Jesus saying in Matthew chapter 18 that we should perhaps forgive our neighbor 70 times 7, what we know is that when Jesus says that, he's imagining a different type of city. Another thing that Jesus does, which brings change, small micro change, is Jesus ate at different tables. Like Jesus, he ate with everyone. In fact, perhaps a better way to say it would be Jesus ate with anyone. He sat at pretty much whatever table he was invited to. But this was threatening to the structure of his community. It threatened the way they did life. Like, you're just not supposed to do that. Every society in the world has rules and structures that keep us all in the right place. VIPs sit at the front. The opposite of VIPs are at the back, or maybe even outside. But Jesus ignored all of this, showing that his way of being said that those at the back were as entitled to be part of his way of being as those at the front were. And that's just not how the world works. It's not how it's supposed to go. In fact, as Robert Karras notes, there's an extent to which Jesus got himself killed because of the way he ate. But I often wonder, can we imagine a different way of being? Can you and I imagine a different way of our city happening if we cannot first imagine a different group of guests around our table? Another thing that Jesus did was he healed indiscriminately. Jesus reached out to the unclean and excluded of society, those thought to be sinners and under God's judgment, the disenfranchised. But he also healed the rich and the powerful. And he regularly interpreted this as the breaking in of a new way of God's kingdom. And of course, Jesus also ignored gender divides. Like, Jesus is regularly seen breaking the long-established boundaries between men and women of his society. Like, he talks with women in public. He allows them to touch him. He heals women. They travel with him. And all of these things breached decorum that was acceptable within his society. And it challenged the enforced and commonly held inferiority of women. But God's kingdom, the kingdom that Jesus came to announce, it isn't just for men. But when equality of male and female still isn't fully recognized in the society that we live in or the church even today, we need to realize that, well, we need to return to Jesus' ministry for inspiration and a reminder of how things could be. And let's remember, it was the women that first saw, believed, and announced the resurrection of Jesus. And there's more examples that we could give, but these that we've selected make our point that Jesus is modeling for us an edge of the city approach to his society. He's present in and amongst the people, but he's present in a way that is different, alternative, and challenging. Notice, though, that Jesus doesn't scold or reprimand his way to change. He invites all of us to see things differently. But there's something deeper still that we can learn if we'll look and see that will help us. And it's all summed up in one word. The word is splanchnizomai. It's a Greek word, splanchnizomai. If you're taking notes and want to spell it correctly, my best advice would be just guess at what you think it is. Splanchnizomai. It means to be moved in your insides. In Greek, the splanchnid was your bowels, like your intestines. You know, that whole area of your insides that revolts on you when your emotions get too high. When our emotions take over, it's there that we feel it happening. Splanchnizomai is generally translated with one English word: compassion. But isn't it a beautifully graphic way to think about compassion like this? The physiological response to what it is that you see or encounter? Splanchnizomai. When Jesus sees thousands of hungry people in Mark chapter 6 and Mark chapter 8, when he encounters a widow who has lost her son in Luke chapter 7, when he meets the ill and the infirm in Matthew chapter 9, in each of these situations, the same language is presented to us by each of the different authors. Jesus acts and responds in these situations because of splanchnizomai. Jesus is moved with compassion. In some of his greatest parables, the parable known as the Good Samaritan, the parable of the lost son, both protagonists, the Samaritan and the father, do and work out their controversial acts of grace as a result of, yep, you've guessed it, splanchnizomai. They're moved with compassion. And Jesus is in keeping with all of the prophetic tradition here. Jeremiah is defined by compassion. Hosea announces in chapter 11 that he says, "My compassion grows warm and tender." I really mean if we are to imagine a different or alternative way of being, we must move the transmission out of the neutral of numbness and allow compassion to drive us. Compassion isn't governed by our city or our society. Compassion isn't shaped by where we live. Compassion is built deep into our physiology, I would say by God. We just need to listen to it. And all movements of justice, all of them, any attempt to help put the world to rights, first begins in exactly the same way as we see in Jesus, with compassion. There is no justice without compassion. Justice won't happen if we don't first, listen to our splanchnids, if we don't feel what it is that's shaped into us. So we could say that the primary task of the church might actually be to be compassionate. And this is a challenge because far too often the church simply evidences a lack of compassion. I had a Christian man this week on social media tell me that our church was weak because we made decisions throughout the pandemic to protect the most vulnerable of our society. Maybe it is weakness. Maybe we could be stronger and ignore what's asked of us. But ignoring the vulnerable, that's the path to numbness. It's not the way of compassion. And also, as Jesus told St. Paul, weak is the new strong. And I don't know about you, but I want to be part of a compassionate community because that's what a Jesus community looks like. Because that's what Jesus looked like himself. So therefore, that's what I should look like. And I want to be around people like that. And so this requires us as a people, even as Westside Kings, as a church, to make sacrifices, to draw in some of our freedoms, to act in a way that values the other. And what's so encouraging is to hear from so many of you who have continued to support us through the pandemic because you too have grasped that big picture of compassion and kingdom. Like, for God so loved the world, John tells us. Compassion is at the root of everything we see in God. So to live on the edge of the city as people and as a church is to first and foremost be compassionate. Opening up your heart, having splanchnizomai, it will draw you into the way of Jesus, the alternate way. That's how difference begins. As Brueggemann again reminds us, the broken systems and structures, they're always helpless when faced with someone who groans the groans of those who are hurting. So what do we do? What's the next step? And the simple answer, perhaps, is that we allow our hearts to soften. That we ask God to guide us through His Spirit to become more compassionate. Perhaps sometimes it just involves opening our eyes or maybe just not looking away. Maybe we read different parts of the news websites. We go to different parts of the internet. What if we went to the financial pages second in the morning after we read about the social issues in our society and not before? In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Like, this is what Isaiah says. But he wasn't finished. In verse 8 of Isaiah chapter 6, we read this. Then I, this is Isaiah, heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me. In Matthew chapter 9, Jesus says to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his vineyard. Like, what is Jesus saying here? Well, it seems to me that what Jesus is teaching us is that God doesn't have an opportunity problem. He has a staff shortage. Like, the death of the king for Isaiah created a moment of crisis, hidden within which was a moment of opportunity to imagine something different, a possible, different, alternative future. And so now think about us Like, we've been in crisis for over 365 days now. And we know that this crisis runs deep. It's not going to be solved simply by everybody having a vaccine. Because even once we all have a vaccine, there's still going to be inequalities and difficulties and injustices as a result of everything we've lived through. The way forward is almost guaranteed going to involve a fight as everyone tries to get out of this ditch, as we wrestle for our piece of the pie, our place back out of the trouble. And this creates a moment of opportunity for compassion if we can imagine it. The moment will probably sneak in on us in small, micro opportunities, perhaps, in compassion, forgiveness, table fellowship, debt release, and equity. Like, everybody is talking at the moment about what it's going to be like when life gets back to normal. But I think the prophets would tell us that our normal was broken. What we actually need is for life to get back to a different normal. And that's what I want to imagine is where we as a church can step in, collectively and individually, and reject the idea that, well, this is just the way things are. I think that this is what it is to be a prophetic community. This is what it is to begin to live at the edge of the city. In one of his letters, Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great writer and theologian, wrote this: "To be a human being among people and to remain one forever, no matter in what circumstances, not to grow despondent and not to lose heart, that's what life is about. That's its task. To remain alert, eyes open, and human in the space that God's placed us in." So may you live at the edge of the city. May we have our eyes opened to the moment of opportunity that exists for us to be different. May you reject it's just the way things are. And may you find yourself with deep, challenging, motivating levels of splank nitzamai.
A wonderful Savior is Jesus, my Lord. A wonderful Savior to me. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock, where rivers of pleasure I see. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock that shadows a dry, thirsty land. He hideth my life in the depths of his love, and he covers me there with his hand, and covers me there with his hand. A wonderful Savior is Jesus, my Lord. He taketh my burden away. He holds me up be moved. He gives me strength as my day. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock that shadows a dry, thirsty land. He hideth my life